Hello, I'm Charlie Halpern. I'm chairman of the conference that we're holding in October at Berkeley Law School on the mindful lawyer. And I'm sitting here with my old friend and teacher, Joseph Goldstein, who was one of the founders of the Insight Meditation Society, one of the pioneers who brought Buddhist meditation practices to the United States 35 years ago. And he also is the person who taught the first meditation retreat for Yale law students 20 years ago, the first retreat that the Center for Contemplative Mind and Society, one of the co-sponsors of this conference, one of the first events it held that was particularly aimed at lawyers. Joseph, do you have any recollections of those early retreats that we held for law students?
Well, there were a few things about it that were really striking. One is just how bright everybody was, and sharp minds. It was also interesting having the mix of law students and law professors, and I'm not sure, don't quite remember whether there were judges there or not, but there was a spectrum of people, in the legal profession, which was a nice mix. There was one particular incident that stuck in my mind, and it's actually a story I tell now on meditation retreats. There was a discussion, we were having a group discussion, and one of the second or third year Yale law students was talking about being in this very high pressure, litigious training, which called up a lot of stress for him. And he made the comment that he felt like he needed to get angry so that he wouldn't feel the fear. And that statement really struck me and has remained with me all these years, because it just points to a basic misunderstanding of how to handle difficult emotions. And he was going on the assumption that somehow the fear needed to be suppressed so that he could act effectively in that situation. And it took the form of anger, or expressing anger. And in the course of the discussion, we opened up another meditative understanding that actually one can get accepting of the feeling of fear, even though it's unpleasant, but we actually can open to it and feel it and be with it, and it not be a hindrance to any appropriate effective action, precisely because we're accepting it. We're not fighting it, we don't feel we need to suppress it, and so one is able then to proceed in a much more balanced, wise, discerning way. So it was an interesting comment which led to an interesting discussion of some basic meditative principles.
Wonderful. And fear and anxiety are emotions that many law students and lawyers feel.
Yeah.
And what this conversation suggests is that mindfulness really has something to offer to those people.
Oh, a tremendous amount, because as with any unpleasant experience, whether it's an emotion like fear or anxiety, or physical discomfort or pain, the conditioned reaction to that is aversion. We don't like it, we want to get rid of it. And so we either contract, we pull away from it, or we push it away. And mindfulness is exactly down the middle path between those two extremes. We don't need to act it out, and we don't need to contract from it. We can create an open space of awareness, of mindfulness, where we're feeling the unpleasantness. Doesn't make the unpleasantness go away, but we get to a space where it's okay to feel something unpleasant. And then it becomes just like any other experience. There's a certain configuration of emotion or physical sensation, and we feel it and we're open to it, and then we just choose to act in the way that's appropriate to that situation. So it's a much more balanced and equanimous relationship to those experiences.
So doing this inner work permits the lawyer, or really any person who's developing the meditative perspective, to be much more effective in the work they do in the world.
Absolutely, because when we're reactive, when we're just acting out our conditioned, habituated reactions, it doesn't give us much option, because we're actually imprisoned by whatever our own particular history of conditioning is. And so we have a very narrow track in which to respond. When we're mindful, it's like the number of options opens up to us because we're not reactive, and we can see, does this call for strength? Does it call for softness? Does it call for incisive analysis? There's just a wide spectrum of ways of responding in any particular situation.
So at first it seems a paradox that the law being such an outward-looking profession, that there's real benefit from doing this inner work. But as you describe it, the two just go together. Yeah, effectiveness.
Absolutely. And it's not only law, of course, it's applicable to the law, but it's really about how to live more effectively and how to relate to people more effectively, and how to be wiser in one's life.
Well, lawyers talk a lot about the cultivation of wisdom, and it's a very important theme to me. But in fact, if you look at the law school curriculum, there's very little about that would help students to cultivate wisdom in their study or in their practice.
No, I think that's true and I think that's true in our society in general. It's not just law school, and it would be a very interesting study even to ask people what wisdom means, because I think people probably have a wide range of understandings, even of what they hear that word to mean. For me, a huge opening happened when I first went to India to practice meditation, because I had studied philosophy at Columbia University, with some very good teachers, and one would think, oh, philosophy, the study of wisdom. But it wasn't until I went to Asia and began some meditation practice that I began to see the difference between a conceptual understanding of wisdom, or of how things are, of how life should be lived, and the direct experience in my own mind and my own life of what leads to happiness, what leads to suffering. And it was meditation and mindfulness which brought it all down to the actuality of my life rather than an intellectual concept. And so this ability to understand how to look into one's own mind, and mind-heart, it's every aspect of our intellect and emotions. There's a methodology. How can we look inward and see with clarity and in a systematic way, yes, these are the patterns that are unwise in the sense that they just lead to more suffering for ourselves, for others, which are the patterns, of response that are wise, that lead to peace, to happiness, to social engagement. And it all comes from a direct experience, not from a concept.
So if we don't do that inner work to really understand the nature of suffering and its causes, we can go forward with the best intentions for serving our clients or building a more just society, and we'll just have it wrong because we've misunderstood what causes suffering.
Well, I think that often is the case, and in the teachings of the Buddha in particular, there is a very important balance between wisdom and compassion. And it's said that both of those are needed. If we have compassion without wisdom, we're moved to act, we're moved to respond, we want to help, but we don't necessarily know the effective means to accomplish what we see needs to be done. So there's the compassion without the wisdom. There can also be wisdom without compassion. We could have an understanding of what needs to be done, and a pretty clear understanding, but if we haven't been touched by the suffering, if we haven't come close to it, we're not necessarily moved to take action. And so this balance of the two, I think, is a really important aspect of what we need to do.
So when we think of how lawyers ought to be educated, we should be thinking about both those qualities.
Yeah. I think it's both inwardly and in terms of one's own experience, one's inner experience, and in terms of one's relationship to the world, I think it's very helpful for the growth of compassion to come close, even immerse oneself at different times in situations of suffering, so it becomes real. So it's not just an abstraction that people are suffering, so that we really see it and feel it, and so there's some energy behind our wish to alleviate it. At the same time, we need to develop a very clear understanding of all the levels of causes behind the suffering, because there are many external social causes, but there are also internal causes of how we understand the mind, the forces of greed, of hatred, of fear. We need to understand that in ourselves before we can really fully be effective in helping others.
It's interesting. In the meditation courses I've taught at Berkeley Law School, the students have just come to this, and the opportunity to sit in stillness and look inward, and then to take the insights that come from that out into their analysis of legal problems and figuring out how to be of greatest service to clients. It seems a direct track.
Is. I mean, and it's quite remarkable, but in a slightly different field, because I teach meditation and I also write. So when I'm writing, I'm working on one of my books, I have found an amazing correlation between the stillness and silence of a sitting practice, of sitting and getting quiet, having the mind quiet down a bit, and the creative process. Because when the mind is silent, we get much more intuitive, and there's a kind of wisdom that comes out of the silence of mind, an intuitive wisdom about different problems that we're facing, different situations. So many times I'd be writing and come to some kind of impasse, of not knowing, well, which way should I go and how should this unfold, and different writer's blocks. Then I would sit, in meditation, and it was amazing. Just in the sitting and making the mind quiet, each time, it's like the path would open up. It would become so clear, oh, this is the next step. So I have a tremendous appreciation and respect for the intuitive creativity of the quiet mind. And it applies whether it's writing about meditation or seeing how to best address a social issue. That same creativity applies.
We've talked about compassion, and the idea that compassion is an important quality for anybody who wants to work for just results, whether it's a prosecutor or whether a corporate lawyer or an environmental lawyer, they all benefit from compassion and from empathy. Could you say something about that and the ways that compassion and empathy relate to our mindfulness practice?
It relates in so many different ways. And, one could say on the most basic level, and I talked about this a little earlier, if we don't have compassion, it's so we won't be moved to take action in the face of suffering. We'll just say, oh, well, that's just how it is, and we won't particularly care, and it can be a quality of great indifference. If our own lives seem to be going okay, and there's no compassion for the suffering in the world, we're not very motivated to act. So mindfulness is what opens us up. We become aware. Mindfulness opens us up to the suffering that's there, to the distress that's there. And this is true, the distress in our own life, which we may be covering, but also the distress in society. So mindfulness opens us up to it, which allows for the very natural response of compassion, because we're allowing ourselves to come close to it. So just a little anecdote. A friend of mine was in the hospital for some kind of surgery. they were trying to put an IV, into her arm for something, and the doctor was, jabbing the arm with the needle, trying to connect with the vein. And you know how sometimes you don't quite get the vein. It's not hugely painful, but it's very uncomfortable and disconcerting. And my friend was in a little bit of distress, and the comment of the doctor was, "Oh, what's the matter? It doesn't hurt." And this is somebody who's probably very well-intentioned and probably a good doctor. But somehow in that moment, it's like he was closed off to the suffering, because it's hard to let the suffering in. It's hard to really open to one's own pain or another person's pain, to really let it in and feel it. It's mindfulness of the situation which allows somebody to come close. Oh yes, I'm sorry, this is painful. Acknowledging that. So there's a compassionate response. And so you could just apply that in thousands of situations.
Well, you take lawyers who are in the criminal process. They might be prosecutors, they might be defense lawyers, they might be the judges who are sitting on these cases. They are swimming in a sea of suffering.
Yes. And, well, this brings up another really important point, because compassion needs to be balanced with equanimity. Because without the equanimity, if somebody's heart is really open to the immensity of suffering that's there, they could easily lose balance one way or another. And so, excuse me, this quality of being open to the suffering, feeling, wanting to help, being balanced with the equanimity of understanding that there are causes and conditions behind the suffering, and that sometimes we can do something about it and sometimes we can't. So it's not to think that in every situation we will be able to alleviate the suffering, because even with the best of motivations, often things are outside of our control. And we need to be able to maintain a balance of mind that understands that and allows for that. Otherwise, we really get overwhelmed by situations.
Well, this is what leads to what we speak of as burnout.
Yeah, exactly.
You've been dealing with so much suffering, and it's just overwhelmed you finally.
Yeah.
And so mindfulness would seem to be a way to assure the long-term viability of the lawyer's life.
It does. I think for a few reasons. One, it does balance the compassion with the equanimity. And the Dalai Lama said something really useful here, which is probably not a popular legal principle. So this will be a stretch, I think, for lawyers and people in the legal profession. He said, "It's not the success or failure of the action which determines its value, but the motivation behind it." So in a profession that measures success or measures value by success or failure, that's a very different template than measuring the value of an action. Was that action done with compassion? Was it done with wisdom? With insight? Now, I could imagine in a legal setting, the challenge would be to combine those two, so that, yes, we can be aiming for success in a particular situation, and at the same time checking the motivation of how we're going about to accomplish it. Because one certainly, and to great distress, sees people in many different fields being very successful at tremendous cost. One just thinks of the financial scandals and the Enron scandals, and where there was an immediate financial success at disastrous cost, to thousands, maybe even millions of people. So that's where the people lost the proper reference point for evaluating their actions. They were so attached to success that they lost connection with the motivation.
And what would the appropriate motivation?
Well, the different motivations, and one that's could be common simply is greed. You know, if people are motivated by greed, then the success of the action is really tainted by that motivation and has some pretty harmful consequences.
And the apparent success, if you knew what the intention was, you might say these apparent successes are masking
Exactly.
the real
and
harms.
we've seen that we've seen so many examples of that. So this is not just some philosophical statement. We can see how this plays out, you know, when people are motivated by greed, or it could be by, you know, anger or hatred. So the very interesting challenge for lawyers, I think, you know, and people working with social justice issues, or even just in any ordinary legal encounter, how to combine a path to, if we want to put it in terms of winning and losing, you know, we'll just use that vocabulary since I'm sure it's often used in those circles. How to combine, you know, a path of winning or accomplishing one's aim or intention with a clear sensitivity to the motivation driving the specific actions, so they are in harmony rather than, as the Buddha said about anger, described it really beautifully. He said, anger with its poisoned source and honeyed tip. You know, there's a honeyed tip to anger or to greed, or there's something that's sweet and desirable, and we think we're going to get something, but these unwholesome states have a poisoned source, which lead to tremendous suffering. So we need a honeyed source and a honeyed tip, you know, and that takes a lot of inner understanding. Very difficult and challenging to see our own motivations clearly. We think it's simple, you know. We think, oh yeah, I have basically good motivations. Motivations are very subtle, very complex, often mixed, and it takes mindfulness, a very clear mindfulness of one's own inner process and one's own heart and intentions, to discern the variety and complexity of our own motivations behind actions. So we shouldn't assume that because we're basically good people, that our motivations are always so good. So this is also a great gift of mindfulness.
And what I hear is that if we are successful in really making mindfulness part of the mainstream of the way lawyers are trained for this profession, it could have a profound impact.
Oh, it would be huge.
But take just the criminal trial situation. Speculate about what a trial would look like if the judge and the prosecutor and the defense lawyer are all coming from a place of mindful grounding.
It's almost hard to imagine.
I know. Give it a try.
Well, now, because I don't have experience in that realm, this is really speculation.
Blue sky speculation.
Yeah, so just as a disclaimer.
Good.
I think I could imagine that it would be easier to discern the truth, you know, of a situation, and often the complexities of the truth, because there are many factors which go into every action, you know, and the more mindful or empathetic we are to every character in the play, you know, where we're not just reacting according to any habitual patterns in our minds, but we're mindful, we're empathetic, we're compassionate to all sides, to the sides which may be in adversarial position. But if we can hold, some space of the mind which actually sees all sides in an open way, first I think we would learn more, because we wouldn't be so fixed in our own position. And I think our responses would be more appropriate and accurate to the subtleties of what was going on. There's a very interesting Zen statement which would be a huge challenge for people in the legal profession. So this would be an amazing practice and difficult. He was the Zen master Bankai, 16th century Japanese Zen master. He said, "Don't side with yourself." So to be in a situation where we're not siding with ourselves actually would enable us to hold the totality of the situation without bias. From that perspective, I could just, again, this is I'm just speculating here, but ideally I could imagine a place of tremendous clarity emerging from that. When we're not prejudiced, basically, by our own point of view. And then in that openness, to understand other points of view, and then to see, okay, within all of that, within that matrix, what's the pathway? We could call it right action or wise decision. So it's tremendous possibilities there.
Now, the lawyers in this hypothetical criminal situation have duties either to the client, the defendant, or duties to the state if they're the prosecutor. Do you think it's possible for them to reconcile this insight and wisdom and not taking their own side with their duties in an adversarial process?
Well, again, I don't want to come across as an expert in this because I don't have the practical experience of it, so I really am just playing with possibilities. I could imagine that, and it's rare, this would be very rare because it's rare for anybody to have this kind of balance of mind, this openness of mind, but if one had it, and one entered into the situation not siding with oneself, which would mean in this case perhaps not having preconceptions about the totality of the interaction and the dynamic in the case, but one is just holding it in a very open way, seeing it as clearly as possible from all sides, and then on that basis fulfilling the responsibilities, the particular responsibilities one has, to one's client or to the state. But then it would be coming from a place, I think, possibly, of just tremendous clarity and balance. And it wouldn't be coming from a place of aggression or fear or, so many other mind states that could come into play.
Thank you, Joseph. Wonderful conversation.